So this is going to be a video about a certain kind of person, a certain kind of intellectual who goes around saying something like, for all of history, or at least since the Enlightenment, things have basically just been getting better. Certainly in the long run, maybe we've had, occasional bumps like world wars or genocides or pandemics or whatever, but the long run trend is in a decidedly positive direction. Sometimes this is called a Whig view of history. And the political consequence, I think, of this view of history is you don't want to change things too much, right? Because things are going in this positive direction. And so we may need to change the details of how we're doing things. But fundamentally, we're on the right course. Today, the most famous proponent of this view probably is Steven Pinker, who wrote a book all about it, Enlightenment Now. And that book is just filled with chart after chart after chart showing positive national level trajectories in various variables. The focus of these sorts of people tends to be on variables related to the material well-being of society, the technology that people have available to them, things like this. In the 20th century, we see people get access to running water and electricity, washing machines, stoves, etc. Poverty has been falling at the global level for a very long time now. And depending on the writer you look at, you might also get some talk about how people have more rights, politically speaking, than they used to. Socially, we have a more egalitarian climate. Politically, most governments now are democracies. That did not used to be true. That wasn't true until fairly recently. And so they say we have more stuff than we used to. The stuff we do have is cooler because of innovation. Crime rates and violence have fallen. People have more rights. All this good stuff is going on. And it's been going on. The trajectory over the long run is consistently positive by these metrics. But the thing about a lot of these things is that they don't really matter independent of their effect on psychological well-being. Right? Like take technology, for example. If you invent some new way of organizing material objects, that doesn't inherently have any value. And I would say most of these things don't. For the most part, they're only valuable insofar as they improve our lives. And if you take that idea seriously, and you say that in the West, at least, there's been this progress happening in basically every Western nation in a pretty big way over the last, say, 100 years. We're left with the view that if this progress really has been beneficial, then across these nations we might expect to see a positive trend in psychological well-being across the 20th century. And that is just not true. I'm going to go through the data on this in this video. Data on suicide rates, depression rates, general happiness rates, etc. What I think these things substantiate is a view that the net effect of this so-called societal progress has been neutral or even slightly negative. And this is somewhat different by country, and it's definitely different by demographics. The one I'm going to focus on in this video is age, because I think it's the most profound difference, where the data seems to suggest that the changes of society over the last century or so have been very good for old people and probably on net bad for young people. And by young people here, I mean something like people under the age of 45, not like children. And to be clear, I'm not saying in this video, as some right-wingers do, that we live in a unprecedented era of mental suffering or something like that. I mean, that is just not substantiated by the data at all. But I think that even this seemingly more modest conclusion that the effects of progress have been neutral to slightly negative has some pretty big political implications because, well, in the first place, we've put a ton of effort into generating this progress. We might ask, well, what's the purpose of even doing that? Why have we been doing that? Why didn't we use those resources on something else if this progress hasn't had a big payoff? And in the second place, it's important because I think it's obvious that there are elements of progress that have been positive. So, for instance, modern medicine. I think it would be very hard to argue that modern medicine or running water have not improved people's lives. But then if the net effect of progress has not improved people's lives, that implies that there are other elements within this basket of things we call progress that are so negative in their effect that they make up for the positive effects of things like modern medicine, electricity, running water, etc. In other words, there's some really bad stuff in there, and so if the conclusion is that the effect of progress has been anything other than consistently quite positive, it implies that there are some very cancerous elements within this thing we call progress, which we should be interested in identifying so as to begin the process of removing them. So with that said, I've made clear what it is I'm going to argue and what I think the political implication of it is. Let's turn to the data. So in the United States, suicide rates fell in the early 20th century They were stable-ish between the 50s and the 80s. Then they fell to a low point in the 90s. Then they started rising again. Now they're at a level that's not been seen really since the Great Depression. But that's just the United States. If we turn to other Western countries, we see all kinds of different trends. So, relative to 1960, suicide rates are down in Denmark, Sweden, Japan, Austria, New Zealand, Australia, and the UK, but they've risen in Canada and Ireland, and they're pretty close to the same in Norway, Finland, the Netherlands, Spain, France, Italy, Switzerland, and Iceland. And this degree of variability across countries should concern us if we think that all of these societies over the last 100 years have gone through a process of progress that is hugely positive. Right, if I give a drug, which I said would massively improve individuals' well-beings, to a set of 20 people, and a few of them got happier, some of them got sadder, a bunch of them kind of stayed the same, well, that would make you question the efficacy of this drug, and at the societal level, this should inspire a similar skepticism about the impact of all of the things we've done in the last century. Now, if we break this data down by age and return to the United States, we see that the 20th century saw a sharp decline in the suicide rate of old Americans, relative stability in the middle-aged, and a nearly 3-factor increase in the suicide rates among adolescents using this data set, which goes from 1900 to 1995. But in the 20th century, we saw before the overall suicide rate in the U.S. has risen, and this is in part because, unlike in that previous data set from the 20th century, in the 21st century, suicide rates are rising among everyone under the age of 75, not just quite young people. And so we can combine these two data sets to compare the suicide rates by age for the years 1900 and 2017. And if we do that, what we find is that in 2017, the suicide rate of people under the age of 50 was higher, probably, than was the suicide rate of people under the age of 50 in the year 1900. And if we go down to Americans under the age of 44, this is very clearly the case. And that, I think, is a fairly amazing thing if we think about all the changes that America has undergone from 1900 to 2017. If you think about some of the technological changes that I've been talking about that we take for granted today, because this does include things like electricity and running water, vaccines and antibiotics and all kinds of stuff, massively improved in that time period. And yet for people that aren't quite old, the suicide rates over that time period have seemingly not gone down and in fact have gone up. Turning away from America, this data set from 1923 to 2001 shows a similar pattern in New Zealand. This data set from 1955 to 1994 shows a similar pattern in France, though not in the former FRG. This is a more short-range data set from 1987 to 2012, showing a similar pattern in Japan, which I'm including as a Western country because, by the 80s it had been thoroughly westernized. Brazil, I don't know if you want to call that a Western country or not, but it did experience a similar pattern between 1980 and 2000. Again, this is a shorter range data set. England has a very large data set. I think this is the longest range one. And what it shows is that people under the age of 35 had roughly the same suicide rates in 2007 and 1863. Again, if you think about all the changes England underwent in that time period, that's kind of ridiculous. Moving to Australia, between 1964 and 2000, suicide rates for those under the age of 35 increased for part of that period, but then fell back to roughly where they were in the 1960s. And finally, between 1980 and 2009, so again, a kind of shorter, more recent period, suicide rates generally fell in Scandinavia, but this was either less true or totally untrue of young people in Scandinavia, depending on the specific country being looked at. So across the 20th century, we do see a good deal of diversity in national trends in suicide rates across Western countries, but there's more consistently been a phenomenon where the suicide rates of young people have either stayed the same or gotten worse, especially when we look at very long-range data sets. And there's no way I think you could honestly look at this data and come away thinking that suicide rates have responded in a way that should make us optimistic about the political program we've been running. I mean, imagine if you had gone to someone in the year 1900 or 1863 and told them that in 150 years there would be medical solutions for basically all of the major causes of death that had existed at that time. The serious violence that characterized Europe at the time would have largely gone away. Extreme poverty in the Western world would have been totally eliminated through welfare programs, and the overt, violent political suppression and oppression of various groups of people would have been totally dismantled. If you had told them all of this, if you had described how rich the average person would have been, if you had described what it would have been like for them to acquire food, to cook food, the kind of places they would have lived in, if you had told them all of this, and then said that even though this happened, and this amazing process occurred in all of these different countries, there was no consistent positive effect on the rate at which people were so damaged by the world they were living in that they were committing suicide. And then, in fact, for people middle-aged and under, if anything, there was consistently no effect or negative effect. They would have known something had gone seriously wrong. And I emphasize this because I'm afraid that some people might hear a conclusion like the one I'm offering and think of it as being so modest as to not have an important implication, when that is really very much not the case. Now, we can turn to depression. In America, between 1905 and the late 80s, the probability of an American having depression at some point in life increased for basically every age group. Research on more recent trends in depression in the general population is somewhat contradictory. I've found different sources saying different things. The difference basically is that some sources say that it has not changed much, and others suggest there's been a significant rise. So neither paints an optimistic picture, but there is this divergence. But contemporary research more consistently shows that there have been fairly large increases in depression among young people in the United States. And even studies that don't find an increase in the rate at which people say they are depressed, if they also measure symptoms of depression like feeling overwhelmed and experiencing more negative emotions than usual, they find very significant increases in these symptoms. And in fact, if you compare Americans in high school and college in 2007 to Americans in high school and college in 1932, there's been a 0.7 standard deviation increase in such depressive symptoms, which is a pretty massive change. Moving again away from America, in Germany and England, rates of depression have been pretty stable for the last few decades. But mirroring what we saw in America and England, rates of depression among young people rose from 1986 to 2006. In Canada, there was a county-level study, and of course we want to discount somewhat the evidential value of a county-level study, but nonetheless it was a long time span, so I think it's worth including. They found an increase in total depression rates between 1952 and 1992. Now this change was fairly slight, but you see much larger changes if you break it down by age. Look at the suicide rates. Among those over 45, you see a decrease in their suicide rates and a rise in the suicide rates of those under 45. In Norway, a data set going from 1930 to 1991 showed a quite large increase in depression rates, which was disproportionately due to a rise in depression among those under the age of 60. Depression rates in Finland have also been rising, at least among the young. In Denmark, rates of depression roughly doubled between 1995 and 2010, which is a shockingly small period of time in which such a large change to occur. And this was largely due to increased rates of depression among those under the age of 40. Now, contrary to all this other data, there was a county-level study in Sweden which found depression rates slightly fell from 1947 to 1997, with this decrease occurring the least among those under the age of 40, meaning that even though this study did show an improvement, this was least the case for young people. And so it still at least follows the trend of young people not doing as well as everyone else. And again, by young here, we just mean not old, basically. And of course, this again is a county-level study, and so we don't want to put that much evidential value into it, just as we didn't with the Canadian study. And so to summarize, long-term data in Norway, Denmark, Canada, but again county level, and America suggest that depression rates have risen in these places. England and Germany have had stable overall depression rates, but depression, at least in England, has increased among the young. The only study really bucking this trend here is Sweden, but again, I've already discussed the issues and nuances with respect to interpreting that study. So finally, let's look at self-reported happiness and life satisfaction. These are just surveys where they ask people, on a scale of 1 to 10, how happy are you, how satisfied are you with your life, or would you say that you're very unhappy, somewhat unhappy, okay, happy, very happy. It's these sorts of very simple surveys. And you look at the EU over the time period from 1973 to 2016, and it's basically the same. So it technically increased from 77%, saying that they were satisfied with life, to 81%, but that's very dependent on the exact start and end dates you choose. I mean, you can see it here. There's not really a trend. If you would pick just a few years sooner, you would have said a slight decrease. It really does not look like there's been any consistent trend. And there are some countries that have seen an increase, meaning there have also been countries that have seen a decrease, but the two on this chart, England and Germany, it's worth noting, even they didn't see much of an increase from the period 1973 to 2000. And so overall, the picture in Europe does not give us reason for great optimism. Now we have a somewhat longer range set of data for the United States, going from 1949 to 2019, and again, there's basically been no change in the purported level of happiness over that time. There's also a study showing, specifically among the young, so among high school students, neither life satisfaction nor happiness significantly changed between 1976 and 2006. Now, I think we should be pretty skeptical of this happiness data, to be frank, partly because it's showing populations which had large rises in depression and suicide rates not changing their self-reported level of happiness. A potential explanation for this is the reference group effect, and this is just to suggest that when someone asks you how happy you are, you think in your mind, well, compared to what? Compared to the people you know, compared to the society you live in. And if people are doing that, if they're doing that mental calculation when they answer this question, if their standard for what being very happy looks like is determined by the kinds of people they see around them, then of course that's going to make these measures not change much over time, because of course in each generation the average person is as happy as the average person is in that generation. And so that reference group effect might explain why it is that the happiness levels in many countries have been so stable over such a long period of time when other metrics of mental well-being have not been. Now, someone might come back and say, well, another explanation is that things like depression and suicide, these might measure the number of people who are feeling really bad, right? The mean level of happiness, however, could stay the same with that proportion of people increasing if the proportion of people who are really, really happy also increased. That is to say, if the variance in happiness increased. And that is a plausible hypothesis, but I mean, there's a ton of data on that, and that's just not true. Actually, the opposite is the case. The variance in self-reported happiness has decreased with time. We've seen more and more people just giving the same answer. And so that is not the correct explanation for reconciling the stability in happiness with the instability in suicide rates and depression rates. But even if we took the happiness data on its own, it's important to remember, it too does not show any consistent positive effect of the changes we've made since the 40s, which is as far back as this data goes. I mean, you're not in a good spot if your best evidence that your political program has worked is that there's some data that suggests that actually it hasn't made people kill themselves, it just hasn't done anything to how happy people are. That's not a good selling point. And of course, we can always complain about data. There are many other complaints we could have about this data, but at the end of the day, the data is what it is. We don't have any better data, at least not that I could find. And no line of data justifies the view that the progress of the last 100 years has made a significant positive impact on psychological well-being. Like I've already said, given that we have in fact solved so many of humanity's problems, this, I think, has to have an important political implication, because either there's something inherently not as great as we thought about solving humanity's major problems, or if there may be some of the other stuff we've done, aside from things like running water or penicillin, have actually been extremely bad. Again, so bad that they make up for the positive effects of those things. Now in this video, I'm not going to try to justify some theory of specifically what those negative elements have been. I might talk about that in a future video, but in this video, I just want to make the point that if you look at the mental well-being data, it does not justify an optimistic or favorable view of the last 100 years or so. It in fact implies something is seriously wrong, and this is one of the reasons why I don't find it compelling when you have people like Steven Pinker and related people going around sharing the sort of charts they tend to share. But anyway, that is the video. If you liked it, consider giving it a like or commenting. And if you like the channel, consider supporting it via Subscribestar. A link for that will be in the description. But either way, thanks for watching.